A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing. Hello and welcome to a special edition of True Crime Daily, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. Everyone in the world of true crime has a story to tell about a case they worked or maybe they lived through. Some are high profile, some you have never heard of, but they are all fascinating. Today's case is about the dramatic story of a mutiny aboard the HMS Wagner, a British vessel that embarked on a secret mission during a war with Spain. It is a story of murder, cannibalism, survival, and the search for truth after a catastrophic event. Our guest today is David Grann, a staff writer for The New Yorker and best-selling author of The Lost City of Z and Killers of the Flower Moon, which has recently been adapted into a film directed by Martin Scorsese. David is joining us now to discuss his latest book, The Wager, a tale of shipwreck, mutiny, and murder, which is also going to be made into a movie. This one we hear Leonardo DiCaprio will be starring in. David, welcome to the program.
It's great to be on the show. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, you are elevating the value of real estate on this program, a literary giant, and here we are, a little true crime podcast, but we're so excied to have you and that you're being such a good sport.
I'm a true crime aficionado, so this is perfect. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, the thing about writing something like this, I listened to a series of interviews that you did talking about your process and trying to cover a crime from centuries ago is not an easy thing. And I see behind you there, for those of you who are listening, he has stacks and stacks of books and files behind him. How did you find the nugget to begin investigating what was a crime so long ago?
Yeah, so I was doing research on mutinies. It's a subject kind of always interests me because it's a very distinct form of rebellion. It takes place within an apparatus of the state, an instrument of the state, a military organization that's very purposes order. So what causes members of it to suddenly rebel? Are they these extreme outlaws or criminals? Or could there be something rotten in the system that sometimes justifies that rebellion? And so I was doing research on mutinies and I came upon, I don't know how I did, but I came upon an 18th century account by a midshipman on His Majesty's ship, the Wager. His name was John Byron. He was only 16 years old when the voyage set sail. If the name is familiar at all, it's because he would later go on to become the grandfather of the poet, Lord Byron, famous poet, who drew on this account. And I'm reading this old account in this kind of tangled old English, and it's the S's are printed as F's, in this archaic English. And yet I keep pausing over these unbelievably arresting descriptions of this typhoon and shipwreck. And then when they become stranded on this island, they slowly descend into a real life Lord of the Flies with these warring factions and murder and ultimately mutiny. And so that was the first thing that kind of got its hooks into me. I did not plan or expect to be writing about a crime that took place in the 18th century, but this one was so extraordinary. It was one of the more extraordinary sagas I ever heard of. And it has and raises a lot of questions about the systems of truth, systems of justice, how we punish crimes. And so it really, it began what would become a 5-year journey researching this whole crime.
So, David, this is not the kind of story or the kind of research that you do on Google. So my guess is you had to get to the original documents. Where did you find the original documents and what were their condition in order to do the research?
Yeah, so the first question I had after I read that, I kind of was like, well, I mean, even though it was fascinating to me, I was like, how are you ever going to tell the story? I try to tell these stories that are character-based, that are all rooted in fact, but hopefully have a novelistic quality. And I said, well, I can never do that unless I have underlying materials. But incredibly, there are in British archives documents from this expedition in the National British Archives, where naval records would go, because the Wager was a naval warship, was part of this squadron that in 1739, in a war with its rival Spain, had set off on a secret mission to try to capture this Spanish galleon filled with so much treasure. It was known as the prize of all the ocean. So the very mission, even though it was military, had a kind of piratic criminal quality to it, because they were trying to basically steal plunder. And you go to these archives and you can they come out in a box. The documents, were from these ships. They are water stained. The ink is fading. You have to lay them on pillows because the binders are disintegrating. You kind of get submerged in this cloud of dust, but you can read them, often with a magnifying glass, but you can read them. And like, for example, there are logbooks from these ships that give a day-by-day accounting of what had happened. There were journals kept from members of the expedition, including even on the island. They had salvaged some paper and quills and ink. They're writing in quills. And so you can really meticulously reconstruct and understand what happened.
So I'm just curious, as a journalist, and at researching, when you're looking for that needle in the haystack, and how exciting it is when you find it, especially if it's a document-driven investigation. So as you're describing how you have to put this on pillows, are you able to photograph any of these documents, or must you write your notes from it? I know it's a different medium that you work in, but I'm just curious about how you document what it is you're seeing so you can build your research to tell your story.
Yeah, it's a really good question. In this case, I had someone help me make digital images of the pages that were in the archives, because they required so much time of study to be able to really be able to read them and transcribe them. Sometimes it would take me months and months to read one logbook and really document it precisely. So yes, you can make digital images. You got to be really careful handling them, but you can make these digital images. And so ultimately what I did is I kind of turned my office, as you can kind of see, for those who can see me, my office looks a bit like a shipwreck, but it is about 5 years of accumulation of archival material.
Oh, that's fascinating that they permit you to do that, because you have to wonder, how do you can absorb a lot, you can have moments, but, even like there's some documents that were recently released in a murder case I've been following. I need to be able to have a copy of it to highlight, to pick up, to move, or I can't tell the narrative of what these documents are telling us.
100%. You really do. And sometimes, for example, you're looking for little edits. So, for example, sometimes in logbooks, do they want to, when people wanted to kind of justify maybe something that had happened in their actions, they may go back on a logbook and add to it on the side, not when they had originally recorded it. So it's not as contemporaneous, so that if it's ever shown before the Admiralty, it may justify their actions. So even that, you're looking for additions in the margins as you decode these. And of course, they would also use certain symbolism you would need to learn to decode. And often the text was small, so being able to put them on a computer where you could just blow them up to really study them. It's a little bit like, you're studying, it's like kind of like scrolls, biblical scrolls. You're trying to read.
And then was almost everything you needed contained within these series of boxes? Because, and we do need to tell what the case was and what the crimes were, but did you then find archival or documents anywhere else, like because there was a court trial? Yes. I mean, they were scattered in different British archives. Primarily, there was actually some records at a historical society in Oregon, but most of them were in various scattered in British archives. There were some letters that were held from descendants who sent me. There were court-martial records. And one of the things to understand, and we will get into, but I think it's very relevant to the way crimes, we think of crimes today, is after several of the survivors will make it back to England, they are summoned to face a court-martial. The court-martial records exist for what they tell us. But many of the people, the survivors, are terrified that after everything they've been through, they may be hanged for their crimes. And so they begin to share their testimony to get their story out.
in various ways. Some will publish their journals, share their logbooks, and they are all trying to shape the story. So this becomes both a criminal trial, but also a public trial in which there is a war over the truth, many very similar to the wars over our truth today that you often have with adjudicating trials and other public events. And each of them is trying to shape the story to emerge as the hero of the story, to live with the things they've done or haven't done, and to be able to create an account that can survive the attrition of public scrutiny and a military tribunal.
Wow, it's fascinating. Like the spin we get here where people hire people, right?
No different. It is absolutely no different. In fact, what was so crazy is I was going to these archives and I would be reading about this war of the truth where they would be talking about disinformation and misinformation. They even talked about quote unquote fake journals. And then of course I was coming home and I was reading the newspaper about quote unquote fake news, alternative facts. And so you could just see these, to me, this 18th century story in many ways felt like a parable for our own turbulent times and for the very nature of truth.
Fascinating. Okay, so David, just tell us in essence what the journey was, what they were setting out to do, and then where the crimes were committed. And then that will bring us all the way back to England.
Yes. So in 1739, after war broke out between Great Britain and its rival Spain, the Wager, which was part of a squadron of warships, was sent on this secret mission to capture this Spanish galleon known as the prize of all the ocean. They had to cross the Atlantic and then come around Cape Horn, which is at the very bottom of South America. The seas there are just notorious. You can have 90-foot waves dwarfing a mast, the strongest currents on Earth. The winds were accelerating to hurricane force. The ships are just being bandied about. Herman Melville later rounded the Horn, compared it to a descent into hell in Dante's Inferno. And so the ships are breaking apart. They also suffer from one of the worst outbreaks of scurvy ever recorded. The disease, their hair is falling out, their teeth are falling out, and the disease is getting into their brain, as one put it, and many of them went raving mad. So hundreds and hundreds of the squadron, there were nearly 2,000 people in the squadron, about 250 men and boys on the Wager, have perished even coming around Cape Horn. And the ships are desperate to stay together because if anything happens to them, if they're separated, there'll be no one to rescue them.
Right.
But they do get separated around Cape Horn, and the Wager finds itself all alone and left to its own destiny. And it ultimately, as it's coming up the coast of Chile, it hits a submerged rock, and the rudder shatters, and a 2-ton anchor falls through the bottom of the ship. Then it hits another cluster of rocks, and it begins to rip apart, and the planks are shattering and the decks are caving in. You have water surging upward. You have rats scurrying upward. Many of those who've been suffering from scurvy drowned because they couldn't get out of their hammocks in time. But the ship didn't completely sink. It was in this, and it got wedged between two rocks. And so these pillars of rocks. And so the survivors, there were about 146 of them, they climb upon the remnants, and there in the distance, they see this desolate island, which is now known as Wager Island. And they get there and they hope that maybe this will be their salvation. And they begin to try to build a imperial kind of settlement with little huts and whatnot. The captain is a man named David Sheep, a new captain. He thinks they should be governed. And this is where we start to get into rules and regulations. He wants to construct the same kind of civilization. He wants the exact same civilization that had kind of existed on the floating ship. So there'll be same hierarchy, same rules, same order, same punishment. But on that island, there was virtually no food.
David, I have a question. Was it inhabited? Were there any indigenous people?
They will be visited by some indigenous people at one point, the Karasquar, who are known as the nomads of the sea, who offer them a lifeline because they go out and get them food. But the castaways, some of the castaways mistreat the Karasquar, who eventually are just like, we're out of here. And at that point, the castaways only descend further into this Hobbesian state of depravity. And on that island where the crimes take place, the island will become like a laboratory. And to me, this is what drew me to this very kind of unusual crime, because this is less, there is one person who's kind of a psycho roaming around the island, killing and pillaging, but most of the people are like us. They are fallible humans, capable of good and bad. And under these very extraordinary circumstances, these extreme circumstances, they are suddenly tested. And it begins to reveal their hidden nature, both the good and the bad. And they begin to splinter into these warring factions. You have one faction, which is kind of marauding the island. One of the members of them is this kind of killer, and the others are terrified of them. And then in the main encampment, you have the captain and his loyal followers trying to live the same way they had lived on the ship. He believes he should still be their captain because he'd been captain of the ship. But there is a gunner named John Bulkley. And this you get into class a little bit too, because on a naval warship, he didn't come from the upper class. So in those time periods, he knew he could never become a commander of his own warship. Yet on this island, he was this instinctive leader. People begin to gravitate toward him. He uses phrases like life and liberty. And
oh boy.
yes. And there are these two then very competing factions for how to survive.
How long is this going on for, David? Give us a time frame of from the time they shipwreck. How long are they living on this deserted island?
Some of them for about 5 months, and some of them for close to a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And so they are now. Is anyone actually taking notes, documenting what's happening on the island at this time, or is that then written later on in a journal when they finally? You'll explain to us how they get off this island.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, many of them will write their accounts after they get off. But John Bulkley, even though he didn't come from the upper class, we don't know, he probably came from the middle class, was extraordinarily literate. He was a compulsive diarist. So he is taking meticulous notes every day using, some paper he salvaged and a pen. And often he and many of the other men, especially as they start to approach this taboo of mutiny, which under British naval rules, a full-blown mutiny is one of the worst crimes, to overthrow your commander, to harm your commander, can get you hanged. So he is very conscious of this idea. I have to create contemporaneous documents to justify our actions in case we ever get back to England. We should also describe one of the other central crimes that takes place on the island. One of the crimes takes place when the captain, David Sheep, who, again, he was somebody who was always he was Scottish, he was kind of embittered on land, faced debts, even though he came from the upper crust. He'd always found refuge on a ship. And on this voyage, he had finally been promoted to captain. This was his lifelong dream. He had gotten his captainship. And then, of course, it crumbles with the wreckage. And he was
he messed that up, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And he was determined to kind of prove his mettle. So he's determined to cling to it. And as his authority is diminishing, he's growing increasingly tempestuous. He was a tempestuous character, but he's also very insecure about his authority, kind of maintaining this throne, of not losing his throne. And at one point, he begins to suspect mutiny, and he bursts out of the little hut he was staying in. And there was one person in particular he was suspicious of. And he walks up to him, believing he's mutiny. It will turn out he didn't actually have a weapon on him, the other person. The captain takes his pistol, he puts it right up to the man's head, and without asking questions, he shoots him in the head. And rather than increase his authority, the captain, this only further unsettles it, and creates a growing uprising against him. Now, interestingly enough, when we talk about accounts and how people describe their actions or their alleged actions, they don't actually tend to deny the basic facts. Captain Sheep doesn't deny that this happened, but in his account, he simply says, I was forced to proceed to extremities.
Right.
I was forced to proceed to extremities. Now, Captain Sheep is not, as some listeners, he's not a psychopath. He's not evil. But under these extreme circumstances, his character is being bent. He's facing unbelievable challenges, and he commits this alleged crime in the eyes of others. He believes his actions are justified. Others see it as homicide.
And so ultimately, when this crime is committed, when a person is killed, because it happens, and I don't know if it's like a jurisdictional thing, meaning because they're shipwrecked, and the captain is insisting on keeping order, does that mean that killing, whether it's a homicide or not, who will be the judge of that? Where will this be decided? What kind of a court? Is this a military court, or is this like, how do you deal with this?
Yeah. It raises a really interesting question because it really would have fallen under the jurisdiction of the Admiralty, but some of the seamen who are beginning to question the captain's authority and don't want him to be their captain anymore, they see a little loophole, they believe, in the rules and regulations, which is because the ship was sunk, then he is no longer necessarily the rightful captain. And actually, it is after this event that the Admiralty will rewrite its regulations to make it clear so that there's no wiggle room. The Admiralty had assumed it would have fallen under their jurisdiction. And it's interesting to say, just as we described a full-blown mutiny as a severe crime, probably the most severe crime under Admiralty rules, the one that there was leeway in punishment under the strict rules. And a lot of times the Admiralty could, come up with punishments that were less severe as sometimes we think in our stereotypes of British rule and law under the Admiralty back then. But homicide was the one case, if you were convicted of, you were put to death.
Oh, okay. And was he ever charged?
So, well, ultimately, and then this gets to the other crime or alleged crime, because that's what's so interesting about this case. And I really try to leave it up to the reader to be the jury. To serve and provide history, because they're all telling slightly different stories and you have to interpret them. But ultimately, Bulkley and his followers will mutiny, and they will tie up the captain, claiming it is because of the homicide, of the alleged homicide. The captain believes that they're using that just as a justification to undermine his authority and to essentially mutiny and flee their responsibilities and duty. And so they end up tying him up and they end up abandoning him and leaving him on the island. They had built a castaway boat, which they then flee in. They have to travel some 3,000 miles. It's one of the more extraordinary feats of navigation.
Well, now, what did this boat look like?
Oh my gosh. So they took what was like a small transport road, a big, that could be rowed. It had a little ability to be sailed, but they were packed so tightly they could barely stand in it. I mean, they couldn't stand. They were just packed like they had virtually no provisions, and they're going to travel. And you got to remember, they're starving. I mean, many of them had already starved to death. Some had succumbed to cannibalism already.
How many of them are there?
So, there are, by that time, there are under 100, but of all the different factions. And in the one main group that leaves in this one castaway boat, and they have another little kind of small transport boat, there's about 80 of them that leave, and only about 30 of them will survive. And they travel all the way. They travel all the way down the coastline of Chile. And then they have to go through the Strait of Magellan and then all the way up to Brazil. It's one of the longest castaway voyages ever recorded. It's a remarkable feat of navigation. And even along the way, there are questions of, did they commit crimes or not? And again, these are complex crimes because they are under extreme circumstances. And it depends on how we want to adjudicate and judge them. But there are abandonments. Along all the factions who try to flee end up having to abandon some people essentially to die under certain circumstances. A small transport boat might sink and there's not room for that.
This is like Survivor.
It's like Survivor. And so they have to
people
decide,
really die. Yeah,
they have to decide who will be left behind. And are they justified in leaving them behind? And it raises the question that, Bulkley, who's a very religious man, is it a sin to want to live?
So two things before we get them back. So you mentioned cannibalism.
Yes.
So
that's a taboo.
Yes, it is. But it's not unheard of even in this current century. If something happens and you have no choice, I mean, it is something.
Custom of the sea, it was sometimes described as.
Okay. So what is the proof or the documentation or the storytelling of the cannibalism?
Yeah. So it's interesting. Most of them in their accounts do not like to describe it because it's a taboo, even if it's not necessarily a crime, if they're not killing someone. So if somebody were to die of natural causes of starvation or disease, as many of them did, if they were to eat the remains. But John Byron, his account does describe it. He describes them trying to restrain a young boy who was trying to eat a liver. And he does then say others, some did eventually succumb to what he referred to as that last extremity. He doesn't like to use the word cannibalism. And then they both groups, the two kind of main factions who kind of flee in different directions. Captain Sheep in his group, Bulkley in his larger group, discuss, or the question arises, will they draw straws at some point because they're in such dire states? And that would mean actually killing someone. If you were drawing the shortest straw or stick or what might it be. And if you lost that, then you would be put to death to be eaten. There is no evidence that they ultimately went through that, at least according to their accounts. They said, each time they approached that moment, something happened that bought them a little bit more time, or they got some more food that would allow them to live. But that was something that was discussed.
Okay, so they make it to Brazil. My question is, if they're, off the coast of Chile, why couldn't they just stop there?
Yeah. So they are in Great Britain is at war with Spain. And one of the fights between Captain Sheep and the two groups is it's a fight over where to go, but it's also a kind of a fight over philosophy and codes. Captain Sheep believes they should take this castaway boat they built and they should sail north, which would remain within Chile, to an island where there'd be, where the Spanish settlements were. They're in a kind of very remote area.
Oh, they'd be killed, right? Yeah. The Spanish would kill them.
They were afraid that they would either get pulverized in a battle or they would be taken prisoner after everything went through. Sheep comes up with a scheme. They do have some muskets that they could seize some kind of trading vessel and then reunite at the rendezvous point where they had been given if they were ever separated with the rest of the expeditions. So he's determined to kind of fulfill his duty and to sacrifice himself for the empire. Honor, duty, loyalty, patriotism. Those are what he invokes. Bulkley says, and his followers, life and liberty. We go there, we're going to get imprisoned. This expedition has been a folly. It's been an imperial folly. We have suffered enough. We want to go home. So even though our voyage is in some ways more perilous, it was more perilous. It was 3,000 miles. We're going to get all the way to Brazil because that's a Portuguese colony. Britain was in a war in Brazil, so they would then be safe. They wouldn't get imprisoned or they wouldn't have to fight a battle. So that's why they picked that route. Yeah.
So they would not have had at this point any kind of map or anything with them. They just would instinctively know because of their training where Brazil is.
So they had, on the ship, they had some kind of very rough charts, but, that area they were pretty still unfamiliar with. They had some, from some of the indigenous people, they had some sense of where the closest Spanish settlement was to the north. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, when the ship sank, one of the things these ships did, because they didn't have good maps, especially at these areas, they would bring what were like chronicles from seamen who had ever been in these parts. And they had a chronicle that they had saved from another British naval officer who had gone through the Strait of Magellan several decades earlier. And so Bulkley, in a really remarkable feat of navigation, doesn't have a good map, but he has this account. And so he is reading the account and the descriptions and then trying to eyeball what he sees to match them up with the descriptions in the account.
I can see this now with Leonardo DiCaprio. I can see Martin Scorsese recreating this moment.
Bulkley has a kind of remarkable level of resilience and ingenuity because, yes, they did not have good maps, but he does manage to get, at least 30 of them. When they arrive in Brazil, they're wasted to the bone, but they do get there.
So they make it to Brazil. Okay. So now at this point, and the captain, they left him tied up. So I presume he's dead.
Yeah, well, you think he's dead. And it also gets to another question about crimes, right? When we, the kind of theme of this podcast, but if there's nobody to tell the other side of the version of the story, are you safe? Does that insulate you? If there's only one story that will emerge, are you safe? So
I think so.
Yeah. So, right. So when Bulkley's little boat washes ashore off the coast of Brazil, they are initially greeted as heroes. They've survived this wreck. They've done this incredible voyage, 3,000 miles. It's kind of unbelievable, right? But many months later, another little boat will wash ashore, this one off the coast of Chile. And on board this, it's just a dugout. They were helped by some indigenous people who rescued them. Is Captain Cheap and John Byron. Captain Cheap at that point was so delirious, he could not even recollect his own name.
Oh, so he survived.
He survives. They are prepared to die. They have accepted their death. They have discussed the prospect of pulling straws, but they are prepared to die. And then ultimately they get help from some of the indigenous Patagonians, the native Patagonians. And so a few of them make it. They are imprisoned in Chile. And so it takes them many more years to eventually get back to England, but they do. 6 years. It will take 6 years since Cheap, you had asked us earlier, since Cheap and Byron had left England to ultimately make it back to England. Byron had been 16 years old when he left. He's 22 when he returns. His family cannot recognize him. And they come back. And of course, they tell a very, very different story. That those people had gone to Brazil, they say, were not heroes. They were mutineers. And that's what sets off this ferocious battle over the truth and a military tribunal. Bulkley charges Cheap with homicide. Cheap is charging them with a full-blown mutiny and abandoning him to die, so attempted homicide.
And so, but because of the difference in time when the captain made it to Chile, does everyone, so the two factions do not arrive in England at the same time, correct?
They do not. There is a period of delay where the British Admiralty is very suspicious. Rumors have gotten out. Somebody and some people have made it out and begun to talk. And so initially, actually, there's a period when Bulkley is detained and some of his followers are detained, but they decide to wait until they know the fate of Captain Cheap. Nobody knows if he's alive or dead yet. And so they're kind of trapped in England waiting. And then lo and behold, they probably think they're scot-free. Suddenly, like in some strange Victorian novel where somebody presumed dead suddenly emerges, Cheap and his few loyal followers suddenly emerge and rise from the dead like Lazarus. And so that's what happens. And that's what sets off this battle.
So then there is a trial.
Yes.
Was there just one trial or two trials?
Good question. They are initially summoned to this military tribunal, and they think they're all going to be tried together for these crimes. Bulkley describes in his journal, which he has kind of continued and kept going, that he is going to be hanged. They have been given every indication. But Cheap has referred to them as my mutineers, and said he will have nothing more to say until the trial, and that when they will be hanged. That's basically his one public comment. And so Bulkley is praying before they go into this tribunal, expecting to be hanged. We don't know exactly what Cheap feared. So this trial is believed to be this kind of momentous moment. We're going to have this kind of adjudication of this. And one thing to understand about the British Navy, because this is a different kind of tribunal, right? We're not talking about a civil trial. We're talking about a military, a court-martial, which has its own kind of rules. A British court-martial punishment was very important because if there were severe crimes, they were punished as a way not only to punish the guilty, but also to send a signal to the rest of the organization for discipline, to be kind of served as an example. So that was kind of part of it had a slightly different, a key part of its raison d'etre, these military tribunals. So they go into this tribunal expecting these fireworks, and lo and behold, they're not asked about any of the alleged crimes on the island. They're not asked about the alleged mutiny. They're not asked about the tying up of Captain Cheap. They're not asked about the cannibalism. They're not asked about Captain Sheep shooting this other seaman in the head without any proceedings. Instead, they only asked them about what it cost the wreck of the ship before they had gotten to the island.
Oh, that's interesting.
It is the equivalent, I would say, of stopping a car with a driver that has a dead body in the trunk and asking the driver only why about the busted tail light.
Right. And why he ran the light.
Right. Or why they ran the light. So why is that? Why is that? Well, mutinies can sometimes be so threatening to a state that they don't even want to talk about them. And these crimes undercut the central claim of the British Empire, which was that its civilization was somehow superior to others. And so they're looking and trying to hear all these stories. Here you have everybody waging their war over their story to look the best. And they're kind of saying, it's the best we can tell. Do we like any of these stories? They make our officers who are supposed to be the vanguard of the British Empire and their crew, these supposed apostles of Western civilization, they look more like brutes than like gentlemen. And so they're all let go. They closed the court-martial. To your earlier question, there are no other court-martials. They were all let go as if nothing happened. And it became, as one British historian put it, it became the mutiny that never was.
Ah. Now, does that ending work for Hollywood?
Well, it's funny. It goes against expectations.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it reveals actually something very deep and profound about how certain nations will want to prosecute crimes. I mean, I just was picking up the newspaper yesterday and reading about the mutiny in Russia. And there was a headline that was an outright mutiny. They got tanks coming into Moscow, coming from Ukraine, right? And suddenly all the Russian government was kind of, it wasn't really a mutiny. The mutiny that, and the headline was essentially that, Russia tries to rewrite the story of the mutiny. So mutiny is a very particular crime. It can be so threatening to the state and its position that sometimes it prefers to not adjudicate it, and they try to become the mutinies that never were.
So interesting, because yes, it's always the protection of, whether it's the military, the country, the perception, no matter what century you're in, you're still protecting the same interests.
This cuts to the very nature of systems and how justice can be corrupted, how the powerful in certain systems can corrupt systems or undermine them to serve their own interests. And so this is a court-martial, which was clearly trying to serve the self-interests of those in power, because the war had been disastrous up until that point. Something else happened, that there was one of the ships from the squadron that actually survives, led by this Commodore, gets around Cape Horn. They're down to one ship eventually, about 200 battermen, and they capture the galleon. They capture the galleon with all the treasure.
They got it. Mission
it.
Accomplished.
Mission accomplished. So they come back to England, and that's the story they want to tell.
Right.
That's the story of the war, because crimes during wartime, again, have put different pressures on the state and regimes. And so they have found their mythic tale of the sea, and they would prefer that the wager mutiny and the crimes that took place on the island fade away and that we forget them.
So this Commodore has mission accomplished. He arrives. He's the real hero. He's like, and what happened to you guys? Like, what was your problem? Okay.
Yeah. And he really was a remarkable leader, that he was able to do this. He was very skilled, very talented, had a lot of Shackletonian qualities. But I think, that these are very distinctive crimes, or alleged crimes, because, again, the people involved are deeply human. And when you read about them, you have to ask yourself, what would I have done in their circumstances? Who would I have been on that island? It's very easy to judge from afar.
Yeah.
Who would I have been under those circumstances? Who would I have followed? How would I have behaved? What was my hidden nature? So it gets to the very nature of who we are as human beings, what kind of prompts us to do good, because you will see acts of gallantry and heroism among the men, but you also see these shocking acts of brutality. And I think it's also, even though it's a very unusual case of crime, it deals with a mutiny or an alleged mutiny, it gets to the very systems of justice and power, and how justice can be perverted to serve systems of power.
I think the really complicated part of crime reporting and looking at crimes really comes down to this question of, and it took me a while to get to this. Good people do bad things, and bad people can do good things. And that is the complexity of a human being.
Yes.
And that's the part that people find so challenging when we see a young adult, accused or convicted of a heinous murder. We stand there and we're like, how can his or her parents stand by them? Because they gave birth to this little one. It's the husband, the wife. It's so complicated, and I don't think there's an answer to that one.
Yeah, and I think especially people are put in these circumstances, that these people are under. And one of the other things that I think is really interesting, because we all like to kind of follow crime stories, and we like to look at the competing narratives that the prosecution and the defense are battling, which story kind of will prevail, which will lead to a denouement in a trial. And so one of the things I tried to do in this book and get to its structure was to structure the story in such a way that gets at this. And so it's really told from three competing perspectives: the perspective of David Cheek, the captain, and his account, the perspective of John Byron, the young midshipman, and the perspective of John Bulkley. And you get to see how each of them is shaping the narrative. They don't tend to lie, but they tend to tell stories the way we all tell stories, which is they kind of burnish certain facts. They edit out certain ones. They leave them out. Captain Cheek may say on the island, I was forced to proceed to extremities. Then you read John Byron's account. He shot him right in the head. And you get to see in that juxtaposition, and it shows something about their characters. So I leave it up to the reader to kind of be part of this, to kind of help judge and adjudicate this, to provide history's judgment, but also hopefully to become more discerning about the nature of truth and about the way we shape stories to get closer to the truth.
That's fascinating. David, we have a few minutes left. There was something that you were talking about on one of the podcasts you did, and I was fascinated by it. It was the origin of some words that we use all the time that you discovered had origins in this time period. And would you share that? Because I just found that so fun.
I loved it. I mean, it's so funny because I am a generalist, so I kind of move around and I don't know things about subjects before I begin. What did I know about 18th century naval life? And so, I spend years researching, and, I was so stunned that so many of the words and phrases that I use derive from this age of sail. So one of the words, for example, is scuttlebutt. Scuttlebutt was a barrel on a ship where water it was a water barrel, and it was where the seamen would get their water rations. And so they would gather around the barrel. And what would they do around the barrel? They'd gossip. So we have the word scuttlebutt. Piping hot, that was the bosun's whistle for a hot meal, mealtime. Pipe down was the bosun's whistle to be quiet at night or before battle.
Pipe down just doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
right. It's one of those.
Yeah, it's just like, pipe down was like, because he would be blowing a little whistle, and that's what we think of it, pipe down.
Wow.
And then under the weather. I always thought under the weather was this perfect metaphor for sickness. It turns out it was quite literal on a ship, that when you were on a warship and you were sick, you did not serve on watch, you did not serve on deck. You were kept below deck. So you were quite literally under the weather. And then perhaps my favorite, which came a little bit later in the century, 18th century, is to turn a blind eye. And that derived from when Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, the very famous naval officer, wanted to ignore his superior officer's signal flag in the distance on another ship to retreat. And he had a blind eye. So he took his telescope and he put it up to his blind eye. And so that's why we say today to turn a blind eye.
Oh, I love that. That's fascinating.
And
those
you
are
could
such
go on-
gems.
Oh, they're gems. And there's so many of them. I mean, I could go on and on. You could do a book on them.
Oh, I love that. Well, perhaps you will, or an article. One never knows. Before we go, I do want to ask you about the challenges of when you write something and it's made into a movie. I know you've got one. I think it's going to be released soon. What is the challenge in that storytelling? Because the beauty of a book, whether you read it and I love to listen to books as well.
Yes.
It's to me, it's like that. It's like a treat. It's like being read to.
Yeah.
I can, in my imagination, go there, and every single person who's ever loved and cherished a book and then sees the movie always says, "Oh my God, it just didn't do it justice. The book was so much better." Every single one of us has said that. So you who write the book, how do you reconcile all of this? What's that like?
So I'm not a movie person. I mean, I love movies like most people, but I've never tried to write a script, and I wouldn't have the faintest idea how to make a movie. And so, my goal or object, knowing I have limited control, you really don't have much control when you're an author, is to get it into the hands of people who do know what they're doing and who care about the story. And in that regard, I've been very lucky and very blessed that, The Lost CZ was made into a wonderful movie directed by James Gray, Killers of the Flower Moon, which is, about one of the more monstrous crimes in American history that took place in the early 20th century when members of the Osage Nation were being systematically murdered for their oil money. That one is coming out in October and is directed by Martin Scorsese, and it stars Leonardo DiCaprio and Lily Gladstone and Robert De Niro. And so I've been lucky to get it into these stories into the hands of people who share my passion for these stories. They're going to interpret it and tell them in such a way, but in a respectful way. And then your hope is, and I feel fortunate, is that because I care about these stories, that in the more ways they are told, they radiate further out into our consciousness, and we become more aware of them. You may read for example, Killers of the Flower Moon. You may read the book and then see the film. You may see the film and then read the book, but then you'll also be drawn to other books. You'll read a book by an Osage writer like Matthews, or Charles Redcorn, who wrote A Pipe for February, or a great Osage poet, Elise Passion, or maybe you'll read about other Native American history. And so to me, that's how history and knowledge and discussion grows. I never believe there is a definitive account. I believe knowledge grows from an accumulation of perspectives and stories told from multiple vantage points. So I'm not overly protective, but you just want to make sure you do get it into the hands of people who care. And in the newest film that's coming out, Killers of the Flower Moon, I think most people will find it as a remarkable and very powerful film and document.
How did the Osage react to that? To you telling the story? Because there's a lot of discussion about who tells the story these days.
Yeah. So, my book could not have been told. It is a piece of reporting and research that is drawn from interviews with members of the Osage Nation, a lot of the Osage elders, many of whom have now tragically passed away because they were getting up there in years, who share with me their stories and help me document this. And I think the reason they did is because while members of the Osage Nation were so obviously deeply familiar, often traumatized or haunted by these crimes against members of their nation, most people outside the Osage Nation, or certainly many, and I include myself, were completely ignorant of these crimes. We had, in effect, excised it from our consciousness, and which is not unlike the wager mutiny. Who gets to write the history, and why some parts of our history and stories airbrushed out. And this was one that was not taught. And so I think there was a sense among them, and some have told me this, that they thought it was time for this story to be, to hopefully have more people aware of this story. And so, for me, it was one of the more remarkable and personal and powerful experiences I've ever had telling a story. And I know with the film, so many members of the Osage Nation were so deeply involved in the shaping of the story and the production and the Osage languages in the film and the designs and the sets. So I think, I think it is important that we, first of all, there should be more access to storytelling for people who often always didn't have those access to means to tell these stories. And I think whenever we tell stories, I think there's a moral, I always feel a certain moral responsibility not to be ignorant to tell these stories, but I do think there is a real burden to try, at least as best we can, to do them as sensitively and respectfully and as judiciously as possible.
I see a theme here about history and its accuracy, and this challenge that we have with what we are taught ourselves about American history in the United States. Yeah. And the challenges of so much that is either omitted or just absolutely wrong. I mean, there are so many people who believe that Christopher Columbus actually set foot in the continental United States. Yeah. He made it as far as the Caribbean.
Yeah. And thought he was looking for the Indies. Yeah. And so, one of the things I was, that really struck me, there was, when I first got interested in Killers of the Flower Moon, I had visited the Osage Nation. I visited their museum, and there was this great panoramic photograph up on the wall. And it was taken in 1924, and it showed members of the Osage Nation along with white settlers, and it looked very innocent. And then I noticed that a portion of that photograph was missing. And the museum director, Catherine Redcorn, who I was meeting for the first time then, but since become a good friend, I asked her, why is that part of the photograph missing? And she said, well, it had contained a figure so frightening, we had removed it. And then she pointed to the missing panel. She said the devil was standing right there. And then she went down into the basement, and she had an image of the missing panel, and it contained one of the killers of the Osage. And I was just so struck. I mean, to me, I was just so struck by that moment. I've told this story before, but it really struck me because, the Osage had removed that photograph, not to forget what had happened, but because they couldn't forget. And yet so many of us outside the Osage Nation, including myself, we had completely, washed us out of our memories. We had excised it from our consciousness. So, and one of those things, that was one of the things that actually drew me to the story of the wager, because it was a perfect illustration of how this happens.
Amazing. Just amazing. It has been such a treat. I could sit here and have you tell me stories of history and the world over and over again. I feel like I want to do this with you every week. Just tell me a story, David.
Well, it's my pleasure. Anytime.
And your book is The Wager, A Tale of Shipwreck, Mutiny, and Murder. Also very exciting. And of course, you can always look for your writings in the New Yorker. This has been such a treat. Thank you, David.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.
David, one thing, are you on social media? Where can people follow you or find you?
Yeah.
Do you have a website? One of those things?
I'm at davidgrann.com. And I'm also on Twitter, although I use it less than I used to, but at David Grann. Somewhere I'm on Facebook too. So yeah, people can find me, davidgrann.com or at David Grann on Twitter.
Excellent. And you can find me at Ana G News, this podcast, all our podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, just a variety of ways. This has been a special edition of True Crime Daily, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. And as we always say, don't do crime.